I'm actually quite proud of my organization with regard to the case of Huseyin Celil, because we have followed it. We have taken firm action with the Canadian government and with the Chinese government for all of the past 2 years that Mr. Celil has been incarcerated. I think most of you know a bit of the story, that in March of 2006 he was apprehended in Uzbekistan and illegally transported to China. He was tried in a court case that Amnesty defines as grossly inadequate according to international standards, and he has been sentenced to life in prison. The information used in that court case was almost certainly extracted under torture, which is the typical way that the Chinese government has of conducting itself in court cases. And ever since then, Amnesty International has been calling on the Chinese government to retry him in a manner that is consistent with international standards, make sure that he is given a lawyer of his choice, which he was not given at that time, and make sure that the Canadian government is given consular access, because Mr. Celil is definitely a Canadian citizen. The Chinese government has given the finger to Canada in this case. The Chinese government absolutely refuses to acknowledge Mr. Celil's Canadian citizenship. Amnesty repeats again and again that our government has a responsibility as well, a responsibility to speak up for one of its Canadian citizens. Speak up for a man who has not been proven to be a terrorist, has not even been proven to be a splittist, which is what the Chinese government likes to call him. Huseyin Celil is innocent until proven guilty in a proper court of law, and there are no such courts of law in China. China Rights Network has written to the Prime Minister on 2 occasions about the case of Mr. Celil, and I think that his fate is going to rest with the Canadian people. We need a massive campaign, which in fact is building in Canada, a campaign similar to that in which we seek to bring Omar Khadr home. The Canadian government must take responsibility for its own. The Canadian government must have the courage to speak up. But the reality is that our policy is too often dominated by money, dominated by dollars. And as a result, our demands of the Chinese government are too often quite timid. I see it as a behind-the-hand statement. Don't take this too seriously. We're complaining, but we're still your good friends, Mr. Wen and Mr. Hu. And we still want to do business in China above all. That, I think, unfortunately, is the way of the Canadian government, even though it does have to be acknowledged that the Prime Minister has called for consular access for Mr. Celil. Mr. Celil is one man, but to me, though he is decidedly a real man with his wife and children living in Burlington, he's also a symbol of millions of Uyghur people who have suffered big time at the hands of the Chinese government since 1949. If that date rings a bell with you, it's because you probably know much more about the Tibetan situation. And the fact of the matter is that the situation of East Turkestan, or what the Chinese call Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, is almost identical to that of Tibet. It is, as Matthew said, a case of cultural genocide. The Muslim religion is severely restricted and severely repressed in Xinjiang. The language is not respected, and children find it very difficult to get educated in their own language, and they are forced to take Chinese pretty well from the beginning of their education. That we are talking about a part of China that is 1/6 of the geographic territory. This is an enormous province, much bigger than Tibet, north of Tibet. Since 1949, the Chinese government has moved millions, tens of millions of Han Chinese into Xinjiang. The percentage of Uyghur people in this so-called Uyghur Autonomous Region is now much, much less than 50%. The Han Chinese outnumber the Uyghurs. Within the past 2 years, the Chinese government has implemented another policy which is even more grossly shocking. They have forcibly moved between 400,000, that's the low estimate, and 1.2 million young Uyghur women from Xinjiang to the rest of China. They suggest that they are doing this for the benefit of these young women and their families, that they can get better jobs in the rest of China. But that is bullshit. The fact of the matter is that this is part of the cultural assimilation process. They are intent upon reducing the birth rate among the Uyghurs, and they are very successfully doing this, with upwards of 1 million young women moved out of the region and being replaced weekly by Han Chinese. This is ethnic cleansing. This is cultural genocide. This is the Chinese policy. Sadly, this is tolerated by the Canadian government, tolerated by the major corporations who sponsor the Olympics, tolerated by the International Olympic Committee, and tolerated by the leaders of the world. The China Rights Network is having a rally on August 8th down at Queen's Park, coincident with the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. I'm not going to give you all the details, but if you want, you'll get them from me. But perhaps just for the fun and also for the notification of it, we are giving a gold medal to President Sarkozy of France and President Bush of the USA, called the Cowardly Lion Award.
And they deserve it.
And they deserve it indeed, because those two leaders made big headlines and got big pats on the back for saying that unless the human rights situation in China improved markedly, and unless the situation in Tibet was turned around to the benefit of the Tibetans, they would not go to the opening ceremonies. Well, as we know, 10 days ago, they caved in. They said, yes, we will go to the opening ceremonies. Yes, we will support the Chinese Olympics. And no, we will not speak up in any way that embarrasses the host country. It all comes down to the fact that the world talks a small amount about China and its transgressions, but in fact does very little to turn it around. The people in power, the people with money, they go on their merry way, cashing their checks, and we, the real people, are left to protest in front of this consulate on many an occasion. I thank you for being here, and let's keep up these protests until our governments listen. From the Chinese perspective, from the perspective of their leadership and the Chinese Communist Party, the Olympics have been a complete disaster, because the Olympics have allowed us, the protesters and the human rights movement and the Uyghur community and the Tibetan community in Falun Gong, they have allowed us to shine a light on the gross human rights abuses that are so much a part of what goes on in China. And the world knows now better than it ever did before what China is really all about. Our leaders may not take action, but now the world knows, the media is telling the story, and China is looking worse than it ever did before. Also, in China today, there is, believe it or not, despite the censorship, despite the repression, a great deal of opposition brewing. The number of protests of all kinds has mushroomed extraordinarily in the last 5 years. So I have to tell you that China's government, which looks so impregnable, looks so unbeatable, is in fact extremely insecure, and within the next 10 years we will see substantial change is close to imploding. Thank you.